So up next, let's explore the historical and geographical context of migration, the intersection of human mobility with legal systems, and the definition and implications of being a refugee. Leading this presentation is an esteemed speaker, Jacqueline Bhabha. Professor Bhabha is a distinguished professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, as well as the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer in Law at Harvard Law School. She holds the position of adjunct lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Bhabha's expertise in human rights and her extensive background as a human rights lawyer make her a leading voice in the field of migration, refugee protection, and children's rights. She is the Director of Research at the FBX Center for Health and Human Rights. We are honored to have Professor Bhabha share her insights and knowledge with us during this session. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Simmons. It's wonderful to join you. And really, it's wonderful that you are embarked on this journey of exploration with people like the speaker I just heard who have so much to offer us. I think our world is in dire need of visionary, brave, and generous people like the doctor who was just speaking. So I'm very, very delighted and honored to be part of this the summit that you've organized. So I'm going to speak, I hope, for not too long, and I'm going to, as you just said, make some comments that set refugee flight and refugee need within a broader historical and legal context. And I'll keep my remarks both simple and relatively brief so that we have some time for questions. I gather that we have about an hour together. Is that correct?
We do, yes.
Excellent. So maybe I'll just start and hope that my comments are helpful. So the starting point for my comments is quite an obvious one, which is that human mobility is a reality that has always existed. You could say human mobility is as old as humanity itself. People have always moved. They've moved for safety, they've moved for opportunity, they've moved for self-improvement. Sometimes they've moved to join others who they're related to by ties of kinship. And sometimes they've just moved for a sense of adventure or curiosity. But it's a very fundamental feature of, I think, our species to move. And this is something that we have always done. So that's the first point. The second point, however, in a way, is a contrast, which is that at the same time as mobility is very much part and parcel of being human, most people live their lives in their own country. I think some of us who live in international contexts or who work a lot with refugees and others assume that everybody is always moving and that everybody leaves home. That is not the case. In fact, only 3% of the world's population are international migrants. That's really a tiny proportion. So 97% of people stay home, live in their own home country. And that percentage, 3%, has stayed constant for many decades. So when we hear people talking about how migration is increasing, how we are facing an invasion and so on, I think it's useful to bear in mind that this rate of international migration has been constant for a long time. There's nothing particularly new about what we're seeing today. Of course, the absolute numbers have increased just as the population of the world has increased. But that's very different from saying that we're in a unique situation in terms of the scale of migration. So those are the sort of opening two comments. A, that migration and mobility is part of being human, but on the other hand, B, that most people, by far the overwhelming majority of people, stay home. Okay, so today, in this short time that I have with you, I have three goals. My first goal is to set out a general framework for understanding contemporary human mobility and distinguishing between different types of movement. So I hope that this will clarify for those of you who may not be familiar with them, the differences between some commonly used but also rather confusing terms like migrant, asylum seeker, refugee, illegal immigrant, IDP, undocumented migrant, economic migrant, citizen, unaccompanied minor. Excuse me, there's a plethora of terms that are used. And I think often people are confused about the difference between an asylum seeker, a refugee, an illegal migrant. Who are these? So I'm going to try and explain these categories briefly and simply. Goal 2 is to set out the legal and administrative rules that govern refugee protection and asylum. Simply. So it's not really hard to understand. You don't need to be an international lawyer. I'm just going to explain who is a refugee, how does one become a refugee in the US, and who can apply to become a refugee. I'm also just going to make a very few comments about where most refugees in the world live and which agencies in the US are in charge of or work on refugee issues. And finally, I'm going to say something about the obligations that countries who host refugees have to those refugees. So that's my second goal. And lastly, bearing in mind the theme of your summit, I'm going to discuss the role of entrepreneurship in engaging with contemporary refugee populations and challenges, in strengthening refugee self-sufficiency, in sponsoring and supporting services tailored to transitional refugee needs. So I'm going to discuss the role that entrepreneurs have in providing opportunities for refugees, for asylum seekers, for those in need who've been forced to leave their homes, including, and this is something I'm particularly concerned about, providing opportunities for young people, for adolescents, as they try to build the blocks for a new life. So those are my 3 goals. So to start with the first, a general framework of contemporary human mobility. So the first point is an important one. Most people move for multiple reasons. It's not usually just one reason. People don't only move because of climate change. People don't only move because of poverty. People don't only move because of conflict. Usually they move when there is a conjunction of circumstances that comes together. They're experiencing climate change, but they also have managed to make arrangements for their family, and they've also saved enough money to leave. They move because they're going to get a job, but they've also decided that this is a good time to leave behind the spouse or children or elderly parents, or they know somebody who's already moved to the country to work and they provided some advice and enough to kind of encourage them to move. So the first point is that when people say so-and-so is just an economic migrant or so-and-so is just a climate migrant, they're usually simplifying. It's not usually the way human beings work. If you think about why you do something in an ordinary day, there are usually multiple reasons why we do something. We go for a walk because we want to get exercise. We want to get out of the house. We want to stay fit. We want to get fresh air. Who knows? But there are multiple reasons. And so that's an important point, because so much of the rhetoric about migration, I think, is so oversimplified. The second general point is that migration, in a way, is value neutral. It can improve people's lives or worsen people's lives. You can't necessarily tell a priori. It can be a huge success story, but it can also end in tragedy. And that balance between success and tragedy depends to quite a large extent on how inclusive the receiving community is, whether you are made to feel welcome, whether you are able to set yourself up autonomously, or whether you're always made to feel the target of hatred or racism or kind of some sort of people who have contempt for you. So I think that we need to, again, look at migration as a complex choice people make, which can have multiple outcomes. And of course, and this is a related point, issues like race, class, gender, nationality make a huge difference. So if you have an American passport, it's much easier to move freely than if you have a Sudanese passport, or if you have a Nigerian passport, or if you have a Iranian passport. So nationality makes a big difference, but so does class. If you are wealthy, if you can afford to get good legal advice, if you can afford to get a visa, if you can afford to pay for a direct flight, you're more likely to have a seamless journey than if you are not wealthy, if you can't afford that kind of travel, if you don't have that kind of passport. So they're very big differences in the kinds of migrations that people make. And many of the people that we deal with in the refugee context are forced to make very dangerous journeys, not because they choose to, but because they don't have better options. And I'm going to say more about that in a minute. So let me just talk about some of the categories and some of the distinctions, which I think are helpful for understanding this field. A key distinction is between what we call regular versus irregular migration. What is regular migration? Regular migration is where you travel legally. You have a visa, you have a citizenship that allows you to enter a country without a visa, and you travel by a safe route. You use an official entry point. You come in at the border. You have the documents you need. You get the stamp you need, or you enter, quite lawfully. That's what we call regular migration. And many, many, many millions of people migrate regularly every year. The contrast is with irregular migration, where you're forced, because you can't access a regular route, to take a dangerous route. You may be guided by smugglers or traffickers who help you to navigate the route so you can enter a country maybe without being detected, or without having to show a document, or you arrive without the legal documents you need, and maybe you manage to get in without being detected, or you have some other complex way of entering. That's an irregular entry. And that distinction between regular and irregular has an enormous plays an enormous role in how successful and seamless your migration journey is. If you're regular, you enter with a legal status, you're in a very different position from when you enter irregularly. So that's a key distinction. Another very important distinction is a distinction between voluntary and forced migration. And so here we can think of an example of a voluntary migration might be a job transfer. Somebody's working in a particular country, in their home country, and they get an opportunity to travel to a different country to migrate to get a promotion or a more interesting job with the same company, a job transfer. So they make their family arrangements. They realize that this is an advantage. They make the necessary decisions they have to, and they migrate voluntarily. Similarly, many family reunifications are voluntary. In fact, that's one of the largest migrations to the US is family reunification, where somebody's already arrived here, and then the rest of the family join. And there are many other examples, people who come on investment visas, people who have special skills that are needed, and so on. Those are voluntary migrations. By contrast, many hundreds of thousands of people are forced to leave their country through no choice of their own, but because life has become intolerable. They may be facing conflict that's life-threatening. They may be persecuted because they're a member of a political party that opposes the regime, and they may be persecuted for that. We can just think of Rohingya minority in Myanmar who were heavily persecuted because they were of a different religion. We can think of the Kurdish minority in Turkey, also experienced very severe persecution. There are many, many examples that we can think of where people are forced to leave their country and take the decision because they see no future. And so again, they feel they have nothing else, no other choice. And sometimes people move within their country first to get a safer place, and then eventually they leave their country. So sometimes it's phased. It's not all in one go. We saw this a lot with the Syrian refugees. So many Syrian refugees moved 3 or 4 times in Syria, trying to get safety before they finally made the decision to leave their country. And another example, which is discussed a lot nowadays, is climate-related migration. So your fields that your family have lived on for centuries are increasingly dry or desertified, or your land is repeatedly flooded, or you're subject to some other, perhaps quick, sudden onset climate effect like an earthquake, and everything you've built for yourself and your family is destroyed, then you may take the decision to leave, and climate would be one of the factors that led to this forced migration. So that's a second big distinction. So we have voluntary and forced, we have regular and irregular. And the last distinction, big picture distinction I want to just briefly outline is between temporary and permanent. So many forced migrants leave home intending to return. And I bet if you know refugees yourself, you will have talked to them, and they will, in the beginning of their trip, say, I'm here for a while until things at home get better, but I want to return to my home. And many people who travel and take the decision to leave have that intention. They think their journey is going to be temporary, but then sometimes things don't change. Conflict continues. Sometimes they establish themselves new relationships in the destination. And so what was planned as a temporary migration becomes a permanent one. And we see this very often, that people come in initially thinking that they are, going to always be part of their own home country, their own home culture. And gradually over the years, things change, maybe in ways they did not expect. So they become permanent. And others make the decision straight away. They know they're going to be permanent. I would say they are the minority. I think most people sort of change their ideas over time, but there are people who make the decision to leave home because they feel that the life that they're leading at home is not tolerable, or it's not giving them what they think is necessary for a reasonable life. And then there are many types of temporary migration. And I think one of the most common are seasonal migrants. These are people who, through no choice of their own, are never allowed to settle in the country they move to. So agricultural workers in the US, hundreds of thousands of workers in the Gulf states from South and Southeast Asia who are seasonal, who work year after year and have to then go home for some months every couple of years, but never get a permanent status, never allowed to bring their families, never allowed to settle. Those are people who are temporary and who are forced to be temporary. So that's an important distinction. Okay, and now just to kind of round out this first kind of point, let me just say a few things about terminology. So, and this is a little bit dry, so I apologize, but I think, and some of you may already know this, but for those of you who don't, I hope this is clarifying. So we often hear people say in the media and elsewhere, oh, so-and-so is not a real refugee, they're just an economic migrant. I bet all of you have heard that. These people coming in from Mexico, these people coming in from Venezuela, these people coming in from Haiti, they're not really refugees, they're just economic migrants. So what does that mean? What do those terms mean? So an economic migrant is somebody who voluntarily leaves their country, could have stayed home, had a perfectly safe life, could have stayed home, but makes a decision to move because they have better economic prospects elsewhere. That's very different from someone who cannot survive at home. So if we talk about Haitians, for example, or we talk about many Central Americans who come to this country, who are often labeled economic migrants, in fact, their life is dangerous. Their life is intolerable. And so they actually are not simply economic migrants. They are people who are fleeing in order to be safe. So an economic migrant is very different from what we call a refugee. So refugee is a term that we all use, and we all use it in common speech. Oh, so-and-so is a refugee, somebody, and the typical image of a refugee, I think, is somebody who's, fleeing their country when bombs are falling, or when there's acute conflict. So, we think of Ukrainian refugees. We think, of course, of all the people now who are displaced in Gaza. Many other large-scale forced migration situations that we've witnessed just unfortunately in the last few years. But the term refugee has a very specific meaning in international law. And the reason I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on this is because this international law definition of a refugee is very, very widely adopted. It's the same definition that we use in the US, the same definition that's used in Europe, the same definition that's used in Australia, in Canada, in many other countries in the world. So when governments talk about somebody having refugee status, being a refugee, this is what they mean. They mean that this person falls within the international definition. And the international definition is quite simple. It has 5 key elements, which are easy to understand. The first is you have to be outside your own country to be a refugee. So technically speaking, all the people who are fleeing in Gaza are not refugees because they are in their own country. they are what we call IDPs, internally displaced people. So that's the first criterion. To be a refugee, you have to be outside your country. If you're Syrian and you've fled Homs, or you've fled Aleppo because it's being bombed, and you are now living in Damascus or living in the countryside, you are not a refugee. And the same is true for people in Ukraine who've moved from East Ukraine to West Ukraine. So that's the first point. The second point, second element of the definition is you have to have a well-founded fear. You have to show that you have a fear of something and that there's grounds for your fear. It's not just invented. It's not just you're a very frightened or anxious person. There's a well-founded fear. And a fear of what? A fear of persecution. This is the third element. So you have to show that you fear persecution. And persecution isn't just somebody being nasty to you. Persecution is a high level of harm. And so for somebody to qualify as a refugee, it's not easy. You have to be outside your country. You have to show that objectively you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted, so that your life is going to be harmed, you're going to be imprisoned, you're not going to be allowed to work, you're going to be hunted, something like that. Not just that your neighbor is pestering you, or that somebody is after you, to pay a debt. No, that's nothing to do with persecution. Persecution is when you, because of who you are being hunted. The fourth ground is that the persecution has to be for one of 5 different reasons. So you're persecuted because of your race, you're persecuted because of your religion, you're persecuted because of your nationality, you're persecuted because of your political opinion, or you're persecuted for who you are. So in some countries, if you are LGBTQ, you're a gay person, you are persecuted. If at the moment in Uganda and several African countries, being gay is a ground for persecution. You can be arrested, you can be imprisoned, you can be beaten. So one of 5 grounds for persecution. And finally, the fifth element of the definition is that you can't get protection from your home state. So say you were being persecuted by somebody for being gay in Uganda, but you could go to the police and the police would protect you and go and arrest the person persecuting you. You would not qualify for refugee status because you are able to get protection from your home state. But if you can't get protection from your home state, then, and you meet the other 4 points, then you would qualify for refugee status. So just to recap, you've got to be outside your country. You have to have a well-founded fear, the fear of persecution, not just discrimination, not just some sort of lesser form of harm. You have to show that that persecution is for one of 5 reasons, and you have to be unable or unwilling to get protection from your home state, because your home state's not going to provide it to you. And for anybody who's interested, you can read the definition in the UN Convention on Refugees in Article 1. But this is basically what it is. So just to explain this more, there are many people who don't feel safe, but who would not qualify. So people who are suffering from discomfort of some sort, or unhappy, they feel, they are not fairly treated. Unless they can meet this high bar, they wouldn't qualify. And of course, people who are trapped in their own country and can't get out would not qualify because they're not outside their country. So the point to remember here is that actually when people get refugee status, they've had to prove a lot. It's not easy to get refugee status. It's not that everybody just gets refugee status, by presenting themselves, as is often claimed. And I think it's really important at this time, particularly in this country with the political issues that we're facing, to be very clear that not anybody can just snap their fingers, come across the border, in California or in Arizona or in Texas and get refugee status. It's a rigorous test. Okay, that's refugee. What about somebody who's an asylum seeker? Very simple. Somebody who's an asylum seeker is somebody who is trying to get refugee status but doesn't have it yet. So they're 2 different things. One is somebody who's got refugee status, and an asylum seeker is somebody who's in the process of applying, and they may get it or they may be refused. So they may be applying for asylum at the border. They may arrive at JFK Airport. They may arrive at a land border, at the US-Mexico border. They may arrive from Canada. and they may present themselves and say, I'm applying for asylum, and these are the reasons I'm applying. And under international law, anyone can apply for asylum. Anyone. There's no age restriction, there's no restriction of any kind. Any person who comes and says, I'm applying for asylum is legal because international law allows you to apply for asylum. Of course, if you apply and you're rejected and then you disappear, then you may become irregular. But when you're just come to the country and you apply for asylum, you are legal. Okay, so and somebody who gets refugee status, it can also be called an asylee. Asylee is somebody who's got asylum, who's got refugee status. They're synonyms. Having asylum, having refugee status is the same thing. So don't let that confuse you. So an asylee or a refugee are the same thing. Somebody who has refugee status, has a legal status, is allowed to stay in the country where they got that status permanently. So in the US, there are two ways in which people become refugees in the US. One is, as I said, when they apply for refugee status at a port of entry, at a border, for example, as I said, the US-Mexico border or to an airport, or if they're already in the country, say they're in the country as a student or as a visitor and circumstances change in their country, they can't go back. Something's changed, there's been a coup, or somebody in their family has been arrested and they know that if they go back, they'll also be arrested because there'd been a political change. And in that situation, they may apply. So that's one way. You apply for asylum when you're arrived in the country, in the US. Another way people become refugees is when they are resettled from abroad. So say you are living in a refugee camp in Jordan as a Syrian refugee. Say you're living in a refugee camp in Bangladesh as a Rohingya refugee. Say you're living in somewhere else, in many countries where refugees people are living in very harsh conditions. They may be classified as a refugee by the UN. The agency is called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. They classify you as a refugee. They ask you all these questions. They establish that you do fill the definition. And then you're stuck in this harsh situation waiting. Many people in that situation, and only about 1% of the people in that situation actually get resettled from a camp or a bordering country to a resettlement country. And that's how some people come to America. In America, at the moment, there's a quota of 150,000 people a year can be resettled as refugees from abroad. So, and that quota is established every year by presidential determination, and it varies. So under President Trump, it went down to 25,000 and wasn't even filled. So very few people got in. And now this quota is set at 150,000. So this is people who already have refugee status, but they're abroad. And then after long security checks and other procedures, they get to come to the US. And if they come to the US, then they get helped. And I'll say a little bit more about the agencies in a minute. So that's those are refugees, two ways to become a refugee in the US. And then there are just a couple of other terms I wanted to touch on, just to clarify. So one is IDPs, I've already mentioned, stands for internally displaced persons. Those are people who outnumber refugees 2 to 1 in the world. So if we said there are about 24 to 26 million refugees in the world, they're double the number of internally displaced people who are trapped in their country and can't leave. Then, of course, there's a citizen. A citizen is someone who has the nationality of the country they are in. They may be born in the country, they may have naturalized, and a refugee can become a citizen. So once a refugee has been here for a while, has got permanent residence, what's sometimes called a green card, they can apply to naturalize. And so the point here is that someone who came in as a refugee may not always think of themselves as a refugee. Down the line, after 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, they may think of themselves as a citizen, and that's fine. So when we talk about refugees, we should be careful not to label people who may after all this time, think of themselves just as a citizen. Yes, I came to this country as a refugee. I built my life here. My family's here. My work is here. I, adopted many of the cultural norms. I admire this country, like the colleague who was talking before me about America. And maybe he does or he doesn't consider himself a refugee anymore. But it's not a status that is kind of marked on your forehead for the whole of your life necessarily. And I wonder if you and the audience might ask yourselves, are you migrants? Do you have a migrant background? Do you have somebody in your family who was a refugee? Were you a refugee? Are you a citizen? How do you consider yourself? And it may be that several of those terms apply to you. And then just a couple more terms that are used widely. So one is illegal immigrant. This is a politically loaded term. Unfortunately, you hear it again and again. I don't use that terminology because I don't think that any person should be considered illegal. A person is not illegal. It's the status that they have, which is irregular. They might be undocumented for various reasons. They may never have had a legal status. They may have come into the country irregularly, as I was saying, with the smuggler, or through a hidden entry point. Or they may have been legal as a student or as a visitor or something, and then they may have overstayed their visa and become irregular. But in any event, illegal immigrant is often used to sort of criminalize people who really all they've done wrong, if it's wrong, is that they've tried to come to a place to have a life and they haven't managed to get a legal status. So I prefer the terminology of irregular or undocumented, but they mean the same thing. They mean somebody who does not have a legal status. Then there's a group of people who are called stateless. Stateless people are people who are born without a nationality, or who have become stateless because the law has changed. This is a rather technical area, but I just mention it because if you are stateless, you are in a very vulnerable situation. And there are about 15 million people, at least worldwide, who are stateless, of whom the largest group are Palestinians. And this is a really huge issue, and people don't have a country that they can call their own. They feel this sense of precarity. So it's something to bear in mind. And the last term I thought I would just mention is unaccompanied child, because you often hear people talking about these unaccompanied minors at the border. Some of you might remember under President Trump how children were imprisoned, and there was this whole scandal about how children were being treated. An unaccompanied child is defined as anybody under the age of 18, and an unaccompanied child is a child who travels alone. So a child who travels either without anybody at all or without a parent or a guardian. Maybe they're traveling with a smuggler, maybe they're traveling with somebody they don't know, but in any event, they're not traveling with somebody who has responsibility for them. That's a particularly vulnerable group, and those are children that states have particular obligations to. So that brings me to the end of my first section. So I don't know whether you'd like to take questions for a second and just have a pause, because that was a lot of information I just kind of dumped on you, or whether I should carry on. And I'm sorry, my dog is so noisy. Okay, we have a question here. So let me just read this question. How does the US determine which refugees will be allowed to resettle in the country when there's such a dire need for resettlement and only 150,000 places available? Is priority given to full families? Do current events like the situations in Ukraine and Gaza impact the number of refugees the US allow? That's a wonderful question. So the way the US functions is, as I say, there's an annual determination. It's a presidential determination. I think it's usually in October. And it's usually, there's a geographic division. It's like a pie chart. And every year, there's a certain percentage of people from South Asia, a certain percentage of people from Africa, and so on. And that percentage is more or less fixed year by year. Within that, as you say, there's much more demand than there is spaces. So sometimes UNHCR will, flag particular people with disabilities, young families, people who are LGBTQ, particular risk, who may be the kind of top of the list. Sometimes countries establish their own priorities, like Canada, for example, has had a particular preference for unaccompanied minors and for gay people. It's said that early on, when you're sending us refugees for our resettlement program, these are the categories that we are most interested in. And other countries will go with particular nationalities, with Afghans or with people from Kosovo or whatever. So there are different criteria that are used, but it is always a very tough set of choices. And sometimes it takes years for people to get through the screenings. So and of course, current situations do affect the choices. So the situation in Ukraine, of course, has affected, and there have been many Ukrainians who have been brought in. And sometimes people are sponsored by family members or by communities, so that also strengthens their chances of getting in. So I hope that answers your question. And here there's a point that somebody's made, important to mention, the impact of remittances, money being sent back home on attracting people to migrate. Remittances represent a large percentage of national economies. That's another excellent point. So for some countries, remittances are up to a third, or in some cases, even a half of their GDP. So the money that people make in this country to send home is enormously significant. And in some cases, it attracts people to migrate. And in some cases, it supports communities back home to build houses, to have a better quality of life. And in many cases, immigrants who in this country plan to go back home when they retire or when they've made enough money, because that loyalty to the country of origin still remains. So there are many different patterns that you see. But I think the point about remittances is central. And I think one of the really important things that maybe entrepreneurs like some of you can do is to make sure that sending remittances is easy and not exploitative. I think very often there were situations, I don't know if it's Western Union or with other mechanisms, where people were charged so much to send remittances to their families. And in some cases, I know in the old days, I had clients who would send, save and skimp on themselves to send money home. And then they'd find that the money hadn't arrived, or that most of the money had gone to some different source. So that's a very important area. But remittances are absolutely key. And of course, they're life-changing for children in many contexts and for others. And maybe I'll just take two more questions, Dalton, if that's okay, and then I'll move on a little bit. So another point here is, what were the key factors that led to the shift in global attitudes towards restricting migration in the 19th and 20th centuries? So until about 1880 or 1890, there was no immigration control. In fact, there was not really such a thing as a passport. Passports were invented. It's hard for us to imagine that now. But the whole notion of a country restricting entry was a relatively novel modern idea, because until relatively recently, basically the beginning of the 20th century, countries thought that people were an asset. The more people you had, the richer your country would be. There are more people working, more people building wealth. So far from restricting entry, people were encouraging entry. Of course, we saw the most pernicious type of that was enslavement, when people were forcibly moved to work. But many other people were encouraged to move, and not just across the Atlantic. People were encouraged to move, through Asia, and many different types of migration worldwide, where people saw other people coming to work in their country as being an enormous plus point. Why did that change? And the answer to that, and I explained in a little book I wrote some years ago, which tries to kind of give a concise explanation for what are, of course, complicated phenomena. The main reason is that there was a rise in nationalism. There was a rise in these notions of ethnic purity, of who belonged and who didn't belong, and which races were superior. So there was this kind of eugenic approach. And one of the examples of that was the exclusion of Chinese people in the US in the late 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which were a very strong example of racial discrimination purely on the basis of ethnicity. These are people who were not charged with any criminal offense. They were working, building railroads, contributing enormously to the growth of cities like San Francisco. And all of a sudden, this new ideology of eugenics and superior races changed the perspective. And so where people previously had welcomed others, maybe there were conflicts over different cultural norms, but there was never a sense of exclusion. Then all of a sudden that changed. And similarly in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, in like 1905, 1907, you saw alien acts, so-called alien acts, which excluded Jews, which excluded other minorities, from, for example, from England and from other countries. So there was this radical change in the perception of who could come in. And so from a situation in which migration was seen as an asset and people could move freely across borders, we moved to a situation in which we had passports and where states then had the monopoly over control of the passport, of who could come in and who could leave. And so that's the situation we still have today. And again, you know, I'm happy to share sources if anybody would like to see them. There's a very good book called The Invention of the Passport, which describes the whole way in which passports became a kind of a normal attribute. So then somebody else says, I think if you don't use the word illegal, you should also not use the word legal. You should say documented or undocumented for equality and clarity. I mean, that's an interesting point. I sort of agree and I sort of don't agree. I think that you shouldn't say a person is legal. Yes, I agree with that. But can say somebody's a legal migrant or legal immigrant. It just says that means they have a legal status. Whereas if you say, once you call somebody illegal, it's just implying something potentially criminal. And I think the associations are very negative. So I have personally no problem with using documented or undocumented. I never use the terminology of illegal to refer to people. I talk about, you know, somebody who has a lawful status, somebody who has a permanent residence, somebody who is an overstayer. You know, can use these terms. But I think it is important to always be conscious that these are laws that we have crafted to allow some people to say or allow some people to enjoy rights that we have and to exclude other people from those rights. So that's, I think, a fundamental point. And the more fundamental point, I suppose, is that all these journeys, you know, Bold Journeys is the title of our summit. It's a great title. All these journeys, you know, people often have to be very bold and have to be very courageous. And I think this is another point I wanted to make, that actually people who come, who migrate, who make these bold journeys are not the poorest and certainly not the weakest. They're often the most talented, the bravest, the most courageous. Like the Lost Boys of Sudan is an incredible example of that. I mean, unbelievable fortitude, unbelievable courage. So if we think of who people come, they're not the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor are not able to leave. They don't have the resources. They don't have the financial resources. They may not have the physical or conceptual, emotional resources. The people who come are those who are capable, mentally, often physically, young, healthy. And so that's, again, goes to the point about an asset. You know, you're getting some of the, far from what some people talk about, you know, you're getting the criminals and the scum of the earth. On the contrary, we're getting some of the brightest and the most ambitious and the most capable people who are making these complicated choices. So if I may, I'll just go back to my comments for a little bit. I realized that I probably will not manage to finish what I want to say, but there are just a couple of other points I want to make maybe before leaving some time for some more questions. So the second point, the second goal I had was to talk about the legal and administrative rules that govern refugees and asylum seekers. So I already mentioned the definition in international law, the 5 criteria that count to being a refugee. And I wanted to just say that refugee definition, as I said, is universally agreed upon, which is one of its great strengths. And it means that anybody can apply. It's something that is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We consider, I think after World War II in particular, that humanity owes people who are being persecuted by their own country, whether that country was Germany, whether that country is whatever country it is that is persecuting its own nationals, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Syria, whether it's Myanmar, whether it's whatever it is, that they should have a right to be safe somewhere else. They should have a right to not be sent back to a place where their life or their freedom is going to be in danger. So that's the first point about that. Everybody can apply. Where do most refugees live? Well, it may surprise some of you. They don't live. The largest numbers of refugees don't live in Europe. They don't live in America. They don't live in Canada. They don't live in Australia. They don't live in what we now tend to call the global north. Over 80% of the world's refugees live in the global south. They live in countries neighboring their own countries, in poor countries, countries like Pakistan, countries like Jordan. In Lebanon, 1 in every 4 people is a refugee. 1 in every 4 people is a refugee. And in many countries, the proportion of refugees is infinitely higher than it is here. Country like Kenya, there have been Somalis living in Kenya for decades, for generations. So I think this puts in perspective the claims about overcrowding or invasion that we sometimes hear in the US, because actually refugees are less than 1% of the US population. And in a country like Lebanon, imagine they're 25%. Which are the agencies that are most involved in refugee protection? Well, I already mentioned UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. That is the UN agency that is responsible for refugee protection, and it works in countries across the world. It works often in collaboration with the receiving countries. So, and as I said, there are some countries like the US, Canada, Australia, who have resettlement programs, and often they work very closely with UNHCR. And in some countries, UNHCR actually does all the decision making. So in a country like Egypt, for example, UNHCR runs the refugee system. So there are different systems in different countries. In the US, I said that there are 2 ways of becoming a refugee, and that one way is through resettlement. The agency that manages refugee resettlement is called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. And ORR is a federal agency that's part of the Department of Homeland Security. And it is the agency that that supports refugees for the first months in which they come to the US. As I said, most refugees are very keen to be self-sufficient, and many refugees have skills which end up being underutilized when they travel. So the job of ORI is to try to insert people, put them on a path to supporting themselves, to get them on their feet, give them some financial support for the first few months. I think it's 3 months that they get a sort of stipend, and then to support them on their way. It's not very long, but it's better than nothing. And it's an agency which really tries to support autonomy. Another thing about ORR, which I think is important to mention, is that it's a federal agency. As I said, it's part of the Department of Homeland Security. So when refugees are resettled in the US, it's a federal decision where they are resettled to, which is why we have refugees resettled all over the states. That's a federal decision. It's made. They resettle refugees in places where there's more room, where the state is anxious to have people arrive, where there's housing is less expensive. That's a big contrast to the situation with asylum seekers who come in at the border and then enter the country waiting to have a decision taken about their case, and then become the responsibility of the state which they're in. So this is an important contrast. People who come in as refugees already decided with the status are a federal responsibility, and they may be housed in Maine or in North Dakota or in all sorts of parts of the US. People who come in at the border and apply for asylum and then are here as asylum seekers pending a decision are state responsibility, and very often they are then really treated in quite harsh ways. And some of you may be aware of the recent situation where some states in the southern states in the US, including Texas and Florida, have been shipping asylum seekers up to northern states like New York and Massachusetts, which has created all sorts of complications, which we could discuss if we had time. So those are the key agencies that are involved. Often the asylum system actually works quite poorly in the US. That's one of the big problems I think that we have in this country, that there are very long waits for an asylum decision, well over 2 years. There are millions of people in the queue. And this is a political decision. Congress could easily increase the funding for the asylum system. Imagine if you had a chronic shortage in the processing of taxes so that no tax return was processed for a minimum of 2 years or more, and that there were millions of people waiting for their annual tax return to come through. It would not be tolerable. I mean, these are state functions that have to be funded, but because immigration and refugee protection has become such a political football, we are in a situation where asylum is grossly underfunded. And so we have these very, very long waits. A couple of other agencies may be worth just quickly mentioning. There's the Asylum Office, who does the asylum interviews of asylum seekers. There's the Immigration Court that decides whether people are going to be able to appeal against a refusal of their asylum, that may decide to deport people or to grant their appeal. And then there's, of course, the Coast Guard, Border Patrol, and many other agencies. And often there's pretty poor coordination between the agencies. Okay, let me just say a few comments about the role of entrepreneurship. I think that all of us who live in a community which receives forced migrants have an obligation of solidarity. That means that we have an obligation to accept that our community is always changing, and that some people leave, some people come, and we need to make people who come into our community feel a part of that community, create a new sense of a we. The we of who we are is never static. It's never been that only people in Massachusetts or in Boston or in Cambridge, where I live, have always been those people. No, there's always coming and going. And I'm sure if you look at the places you live, that's true too. There are some families that have been there for generations, and there are others who are newly arrived, and that's fine. And the more we accept the necessity for a transformative we, the better we're going to do. So that's the first point. I think we have an obligation of solidarity. But that means that local people also have to be supported. What really creates resentment and hostility, and sometimes, regrettably, xenophobia, is when people have a perception that it's not fair, that some newly arrived people jump the queue, get housing, which they've been waiting for years, and that creates really a real hostility, understandably. That's only human. So I think that state actors, entrepreneurs, businesses have a responsibility to think about the needs both of refugees and newly arrived migrants, but also of local communities into whom those migrants move, so that you're building solidarity both ways. And in my view, the most effective way of doing this is to create opportunities for self-sufficiency, where people can thrive, where people can support themselves and their families, which is what people want. People are not keen, unless they are mentally ill or have some terrible trauma, which of course some people do have, but most people are not keen just to be on the receiving end of somebody else's charity. It's humiliating, it's unrewarding, it's unfulfilling. Most people want to be able to support themselves, to feel that they are contributing. And so I think it is the responsibility of governments, and it is the responsibility of businesses, and it's the responsibility of all of us in the community, you know, religious organizations, churches, mosques, synagogues, schools, local community groups, play groups, to really have that sense of building solidarity jointly. And I think there's so much we can do. So I'm going to conclude just with a couple of final points. One is, if you want to read a really good book about how entrepreneurship can really be an asset for supporting refugees, I would recommend a book written by a friend and colleague of mine in England. He's called Alexander Betts, Betts, and the book is called The Wealth of Refugees, which is a pun on Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. But it's about this whole idea of entrepreneurship and building refugee self-sufficiency. That's one point I wanted to make. The second point is that there are some good practice examples, which I think we could do well to emulate. In Germany, as some of you will no doubt remember, when the so-called Syrian refugee crisis exploded in Europe, Angela Merkel, who was then the chancellor, opened the doors very uncharacteristically, but in part, no doubt, because of Germany's very complex World War II history, and let in over 1 million Syrian refugees in a very short space of time. And I spent quite a lot of time in Germany looking at how that experiment, if you like, has worked out. And it's been very interesting and impressive. What the Germans did is that they decided that everybody who came in as a refugee, unless they were over a certain age or had a disability, had to learn German. And they set up, programs, free programs to encourage that. And then they set up many skill training centers so that people with skills from back home, who might have been carpenters or dentists or car mechanics or computer engineers, could re-credential with the German equivalent so that they could then present themselves to an employer on an equal footing. And within about 7 to 9 years of the experiment, I think it's over 70% of Syrians are employed. And many of them are employed in jobs at their own skill level, which is saying a lot, because unfortunately, so many refugees end up as, Uber drivers or pizza deliverers when they have a qualification as a neurologist or something, which is a huge waste. So that, I think, is one very good example. And the very last point I want to make is about young people. I think that, and I'm sure many of you know this as parents, that one of the most important things we give our children is not just the best education we can, but also introduction to internships, apprenticeships, ways of transitioning from school to work. That's a very tricky transition. And many, I think, of middle-class kids benefit from their parents' social network, from friends, from community members who give them a shoe in. Well, that's something that refugee kids and many immigrant kids don't get. And I think redistributing access to apprenticeships, internships, summer work, programs that enable people from different backgrounds with families who don't have those connections to find work and to find contacts, expose them to the sorts of work they might do, is an enormously important redistributive activity that all of us should think about and can engage in. So I think maybe I'll leave it at that, Dalton, if that's all right. And I'm sorry I've taken up most of my time, but
excellent. And I know we're running long. I do have one question I want to ask. Another contemporary of yours and Alexander Betts is Paul Collier, and he writes in one of his books the idea when it comes to policy, how difficult it is to formulate policy for refugees, asylees, immigrants. And he used this term, the headless heart or the heartless head, when it comes to putting policy together. I wonder if you agree with that description in terms of how some countries, how some wealthy nations go about, putting together the policies that will allow refugees to enter.
Yes, I think so. I think that, I think I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what he's getting at. I think certainly the heartless part of it is all too evident. It's all too evident how people are, pushed, as I say, into these very dangerous journeys because we don't have the compassion, we don't have the sense of solidarity that we should have with people who, as we might say there, but for the grace of God, go all of us. So I also think, yes, the headless part is also very true. There's so many advantages, so many benefits from having much more capacious legal or regular avenues to take the somebody's point about not using legal and illegal maybe, but certainly we should be including much more attention to increasing regular pathways. And some of that's been done, but not done well. This current administration has claims to and has tried, I think, to increase regular pathways for Central Americans, for example. But I know from colleagues who work in that system that the computers crash, they're understaffed, appointments are way off. So if you're serious about it, you have to do a good job. So yes, you need the heart and you need the head. So I think that's a nice way to put it. And Paul Collier and Alex Betts are really thoughtful people on this topic for sure.
And I'd also recommend people read your book, Can We Solve the Migration Crisis? It is written for anyone who has any level of interest with no background in this at all. Very well done. Enjoyed it. And I think everyone, especially here, would enjoy reading that.
Thank you.
And Elaine is asking if we can find a future speaker who can share what's happening in Canada. And yeah, we will work toward that. And I believe we have someone on Friday who will speak a little bit about that. That would be Tarek Haddad of Peace by Chocolate. So he will have some insights into the Canadian policies. Professor, thank you so much for your insights and your time. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for doing this. And good luck.
Certainly. And that's it for today. Tomorrow, we will kick off with Lamin Zarad, a refugee from Azerbaijan. He is going to tell us about his new venture, and we'll also be hearing from the Rotary Action Group on refugees, forced displacement, and migration. Until then, we will see you tomorrow.